Maybe don't go by the TV.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Fuchs with the National Council on Independent Living. I want to welcome you all to our latest ISLEnet teleconference and webinar, Approaches to Emerging Systems Advocacy in SILS. Today's presentation, as always, is brought to you by the SILNet Technical Assistance Project. The SILNet is operated through a partnership among ILRU, NICL, and Utah State University's Center for Persons with Disabilities, and APRIL. Support for the project is provided by the Administration on Community Living at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So we are recording today's call, as always, so that we can archive it on ILRU's website. That will be available within usually 48 hours or less, so that you can review the presentation or share it with your colleagues. So we are in presentation mode right now, which means that we are live and you all are muted, but we do have a number of ways to ask questions today, so I would encourage you all to take advantage of that. We have a lot of time built into the presentation today just for your questions. So first of all, in the Zoom platform, you should notice one of the menu options says Q&A. You can click there to ask your questions anytime during the call. We are going to wait until our Q&A breaks to address them, but please share your questions there. If you accidentally type a question in the chat, that's okay. I'll find it there and I'll be sure to address them, and try to put them in the Q&A if you can. Also, if you are on the full screen cart captioning today, there's also a chat option there. So I'm logged in to that chat, and you can ask your questions there as well. And I'll be sure to voice them during our Q&A break. And the final question, and I would ask that you only do this if you cannot access those other options for some reason, but you are also welcome to send me your questions by email. And that's a little more difficult for me to get to, but I'm happy to do that if there's some kind of access issue with the webinar and you'd prefer to send your question by email. Okay, so as I mentioned, captioning is available. You can view the captioning by selecting the More options and then clicking Closed Captioning on the Zoom platform. That box is, you can make that box larger by clicking the arrow in the top right-hand corner. If you still would prefer to have a larger font or be able to change the font or contrast, I'd recommend that you check out the full screen cart captioning at Stream Text. That link is a little long to read out, but that was sent to you in the confirmation email that you received with the connection instructions for the call. And finally, when we finish today, you'll actually have the evaluation form open up on your screen. So when you close the webinar, that eval form will pop up. And it's very short, it's easy to complete. I hope that you'll give us your thoughts there. We do take your evaluation feedback really seriously. We use it all the time as we make decisions about how to operate and improve the ISLEnet project. So thanks in advance for that. Okay, that's all the housekeeping stuff I wanted to go through, but I want to welcome our presenters for today and thank them for being here and for all the work that they've put into this presentation over the last few weeks. First with us, we have Candace Coleman. Candace is the racial justice organizer at Access Living. She also heads up the Advanced Youth Leadership Power group. Michelle Garcia has been the Latino community organizer at Access Living since 2009. And Amber Smock is the director of advocacy and external affairs at Access Living. So all of you, it's been a pleasure working with you over the last couple months, and I really appreciate the time that you've put into this. I know that it is not easy to put together presentations like this for centers on top of your very full-time jobs, more than full-time jobs, and I really appreciate that you all were willing to share your expertise. Before we turn it over to the folks at Access Living, I'm going to just review the next couple slides. Here on slide 3 is just a reminder about that evaluation I mentioned, and then also you'll see that Candace, Michelle, and Amber have been kind enough to share their email addresses for contact. I will add too that if you all have any questions after the fact, you're also welcome to email me. My email is just tim@ncil.org. It's pretty easy. And if I can't answer your question, I'll be happy to forward it along and get you an answer. And then here on slide 4, we have our learning objectives that you might recognize from the original training announcement you saw. So first, we're going to talk about an understanding of systems advocacy as a SIL core service that builds community and changes lives. Next, elements of a systems advocacy model for emerging issue areas that, when used together, build relationships, strong communities, and successful goal-based community campaigns. Next, effective strategies for recruiting potential leaders and advocates in communities affected by multiple systems of oppression. And finally, strategies for keeping your advocates energized, committed, and involved. All right, I'm going to go ahead to slide 5. That's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Amber, who's going to get us started today. Amber?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Amber Smock, and as Tim said, I'm the Director of Advocacy for Access Living. For this first slide, in order to start off with, we wanted to give you a quick sense of Access Living's programs. So here's a quick overview of Access Living's programs. So we've been based in Chicago since 1980. Our service area is the city of Chicago. We have about 65 staff, and we have 3 program departments: independent living, advocacy, and civil rights, which is our legal team. We have a legal staff of 3 attorneys on staff. The advocacy department, which I run, has about 10 staff who are focused on systems advocacy. For us, Access Living's version of systems advocacy is a hybrid of community organizing and policy work, and you will be learning a lot about that today. Next.
Hi, I'm Michelle Garcia. I am the Latino community organizer at Access Living. And I'll be talking about responding to changes in what the community needs. So over the years, we here at Access Living have had many hard conversations about addressing the needs of people with disabilities and experiencing disparities because of race, gender, immigration status, and for also those who are LGBTQIA, which means they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, queer, intersex, and asexual. Our advocacy department has developed disability justice and immigrant justice. We will focus on emerging systems advocacy issues in these two areas today.
All right, next. This is Amber speaking. So I'd like to provide a little insight on the work process in the advocacy department at Access Living. We rely on being able to shift systems advocacy approaches as needed. So what that means is that for certain systems advocacy efforts, a community organizing approach is appropriate. Sometimes a community organizing approach can only take advocacy so far, and when that happens, we may need to look at a policy approach or a legal approach, direct action approach, media approach, etc. So we really rely on being able to be flexible and what approach we will have to attack a particular systems advocacy item. And I do want to emphasize that when I say systems advocacy, I'm saying that that is different from individual advocacy. When we talk about systems advocacy at Access Living, we are talking about laws, practices, big community patterns of problems that affect a lot of people. So those are the systems advocacy work. Those are the system advocacy that, I'm sorry, that's how we would define systems advocacy. We address about 10 to 12 different systems advocacy issue areas at any given time. And how we keep that together is we have weekly government affairs staff meetings that include staff across all of our departments. So not only do we have the members of the advocacy department, but we also have representatives from independent living and our civil rights legal staff and our executive team all working together once a week to make sure we're on top of long-term and short-term response on systems advocacy. Our community organizers also have weekly staff meetings, and our community organizing team supports 6 community organizing groups who have multiple meetings per month. And they also meet monthly in a coalition or workshop meeting called Power to the People. So we have lots and lots and lots of meetings, but what that really is a process of discussion, sharing things, learning. And so while we would not say we're the absolute perfect model to do advocacy work, we're always in a position of learning, but dialogue is an important part of that process. And finally, it's really important for us that our advocacy work, whatever it is that we do, has to fit with Access Living mission and follow strategic plan goals. And I'm going to say why that's important. We really need, when we are addressing very challenging systems advocacy efforts, it is important that Access Living be there to back the work up. And it really helps when the work fits with the mission and follows strategic plan goals, so we can provide very good reasons for taking on particularly challenging systems efforts. Next slide.
So I'm Candace Coleman. I'm the racial justice organizer. And a few ways that we identify emerging issues within our groups and our work. Sometimes in systems advocacy meetings, issues come up that have never been addressed before, either within our organization or within the community, that impact people with disabilities. What may arise are problems that our community members may face, and they're sharing with us, and we see it as a systemic issue. What also may happen is that things come up within the news or within the media on local levels that have directly impact our advocates in our groups. And so that allows us to look into issues that may come up. Access Living may not have a position at the time that these issues come up. So new policies get filtered through our policy screening tools that was developed so that it could coordinate with our advisory committee and our board to help us decide which direction to go into. Next slide.
Yeah, this is Amber speaking. I would like to add that I believe Tim will be disseminating that policy screening tool to you, so you can see what that tool is. And we'd be happy to answer questions later on about how to use it. Okay.
So this is Michelle again. I wanted to add to both Candace and Amber. So for Access Living, our systems advocacy is rooted in real life experiences from our community members, as Candace said, what we hear from them. The powerful change so we want our members to feel powerful in doing this change. We do intentional recruitment, and we try to engage the members of our community who are directly affected or impacted by the multiple systems of oppression. We are not perfect, obviously. We still have a lot to learn, and we learn a lot from our mistakes as we go doing our work. We do always remain conscious of needing to learn new things about people living with the disability experience.
Next. Okay, this is Amber speaking. So what we'd like to do today is share with you some of the story of our process. For us at Access Living, our process pulls together community organizing and systems advocacy. You can't take these things apart. It's very important. Using both has allowed us to identify emerging issues and solutions from stakeholders. So what we're going to be talking about today is the work that Candace and Michelle have been doing specifically on, first, racial justice and disabilities through Advanced Youth Leadership Power, which is the group that Candace supports. And second, immigration and disability through the group Cambiando Vidas, which is Spanish for Changing Lives, which is supported by Michelle. Next.
This is Candace again. I have the pleasure of working with AYLP, which is also known as Advanced Youth Leadership Power. We were established in 2005. We have our members include young people with different types of disabilities, but also represent different communities of color that include people who are Black, Latino, Asian, and then we also have a few white people who are in the group. That makes up young people, and we consider the ages 21 to 40 as young adults. AYLP started out advocating on disability and education issues. One was education issues that impacted college level and actually entering into college. And another was a lot working on our special education areas. Over the years, we've transitioned to disability and racial justice topics, such as the school to prison pipeline. How the school to prison pipeline is defined is when you're in school, there are a set of rules that are put in place in order for you to behave in certain types of ways. But unfortunately, in our city, there are a lot of avenues in which students can get into the prison system. So there are things like booking stations within the school, and the policies can be really minor infractions that lead the police coming to the school. And so we found that students with disabilities were getting impacted more than students without disabilities, which led them into the jail system. And so that's why we call it the school to prison pipeline. Next slide.
Okay, so now it's Michelle. I'm going to talk to you about Cambiando Vidas, which again, like Amber said before, means changing lives, or the Spanish for changing lives in English. Cambiando Vidas began in 2009 with members primarily Latinos, Latinx, Latinos, and so it's an open space for Latinx with disabilities to come and talk about the issues related to the Latinx community. The majority of the members are immigrants with disabilities. So this obviously brings in more as to why we focused a lot on immigration issues. Cambiando Vidas got started organizing more so on physical access within Latino neighborhoods in Chicago. And also supporting individuals who needed access to medical equipment, but that also, so that branched us out into getting more individuals into the group. Next, sorry, I forget the next part.
The ways in which we recruit members to join our groups, one of the ways is that we engage in a process of community education about disability in our communities that look for potential leaders and community members. AYLP's examples included recruiting through schools, community events like street fairs, and word of mouth. In Cambiando Vidas, they did a lot of street flyering, recruiting at planned workshops for Latinx with disabilities events, and also making sure that they met with members within Latino communities and not always at Access Living.
This is Amber. I would just like to ask Michelle and Candace something about this slide that I think is very important for the emerging issues side of this presentation. One is that when we discussed creating this slide and we talked about examples for recruitment for both of these groups, I think we also talked about how these methods of recruiting people also had to be culturally competent for the types of groups. Like, it was really important to look for spaces where you have people of color or people who are immigrants. Can we talk a little bit more about how those examples are specific to the types of folks you're looking for?
Sure. For me, within my community, I'm always looking for different communities of people of color. In the city of Chicago, a lot of people are located on the south and west sides. And so it was important for me to reach out to community events that were on the south and west side. So one example is there's a major parade in the city of Chicago that starts the school year. It's called the Bud Billiken Parade. It was important, at least for me. I knew that was a major event where a lot of students and community members would be. And so it was important for me to get Access Living and AYLP's organization out there and visible so that people can learn that there was a disability rights organization within the city of Chicago and that they had support with people who actually were African American within the groups to talk about disability.
As for Cambiando Vidas, so it's pretty similar to what Candace mentioned. However, we go a little bit into of building a trust with the member and their families, because of the fact that many of them are immigrants. Many of them, when we approach them, it's not as easy for them to trust a person or me, for example, saying, oh, I have this to offer, because they, for one, are not thinking that they would qualify for anything given their status. So I let them know that it doesn't matter their status in the country in order to get or be a part of Cambiando Vidas and get access to services here from Access Living, and we seek other services around the city for them. So that's what brings more people into the group and gets them involved. So the issue or the idea of building that trust is crucial for Cambiando Vidas and has been really, really key in our work. As well as what Candace mentioned, going to street festivals, fairs, parades. Cambiando Vidas is involved in different parades and festivals as well.
I just want to add that the point about cross-educating community groups is very important and crucial as well, because there are community organizations within our various communities that reach out to a lot of people, but they don't necessarily know the disability information or knowledge that we know. And so cross-educating and doing forums on disability awareness with them allows them to help us recruit new members to our groups.
So this is Amber. Thank you. Okay, I think we're ready to go to the next slide.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the dialogue and discovery that we have with our community members in order to talk about the issues or problems that we may have and how we work within our groups. So we facilitate group meetings, group discussions to talk about these issues or problems within the community. So like, for example, AYLP talks about, the Scosupedan pipeline or other issues that they might find in their communities. We talk about, Cambiando Vidas talks about issues on immigration, for example, and how could we make sure that the voices of immigrants with disabilities are heard. So it is very important for us to make sure that the voices of our communities are heard. This is why we have these meetings and these discussions. So just so that when we are able to bring it to the table, it's all centered around our dialogue with our group.
Okay, so we could head to the next slide. Do we have questions?
We are our questions and answers. So we'll take over here. And again, you can ask your questions in the Q&A feature, or if you're on the full screen cart, you can type your question out in the chat there, and I'll be sure to voice it. A couple questions just came in on the chat, and as promised. So let's see, first question comes from the folks at RICV. What kind of workshops do you do with the community to bring people in? Michelle and Candace, do you mind tackling that?
Sure. A few workshops that we've done include disability awareness. They might go over our history. It may go over culturally how we express ourselves. It might include like what accommodations are in a general term, not going too deep. And it may go over like some of the experiences. We use a lot of our advocates go with us to these events, and they tell their personal story about experiences that they may have had in different systems, whether it's in the school system or the medical system or just being a member, a part of the community. And so those are a few things that we cover. We also talk a lot about cultural events that we either want to be a part of or things that interest our consumers individually. So it just depends on what our audience is.
As for Cambiando Vidas, so it's been an array of workshops. We began talking about what does it mean to you as a Latinx with a what does it mean to be a Latinx with a disability, and what does that mean to you and then to your family. And we did this because as a Latinx with a disability myself and the people that are around me, so the family is very overprotective, and we found that in many instances. So we had to, break in, and we did workshops on, being a Latinx with a disability. What does that mean? So that's how we began. But then we moved on more towards, what are your rights? And we did workshops on that. And we continue with that more so now than ever with knowing your rights on immigration. Because again, we have found that that's a very important topic. So we do these very more often than ever. So that's where we do some workshops on disability awareness, but they're more focused on your rights.
I want to add that we talk about the independent living philosophy and the disability rights movement, and we also discuss the medical model versus the social model of how disability is defined.
This is Amber. Just one quick thing I also want to say is, as a reminder, the groups that Candace and Michelle facilitate are just two of our community organizing groups. So we have 3 or 4 other groups that are doing some similar types of work, but they may be focusing on housing issues, or they may be focusing on healthcare issues specifically, or they may be focusing on deinstitutionalization. So I do think that each group has a particular, there's something to say, but I want to point out again that for Access Living to focus this heavily on racial justice and immigration particularly is new. This is not something that we were necessarily doing 10 years ago. It is something that's come up and that has evolved over time through conversations with the community, advocacy by staff, discussions with funders, et cetera. So I just want to provide that context as well.
Okay, great examples, thanks. So Beta asks, can you give us an example of a successful campaign on a specific issue? So that's actually something that we're going to get into a little bit later in the call. So I'm actually going to skip that one for now. We've got concrete examples. And then Bonnie asks, so how does Access Living get compensated for services offered to consumers that aren't citizens? Amber, you care to respond to that, or Michelle?
I'm sorry, I'm waiting for the caption to catch up. So, compensated to. Well, this is Amber speaking. So, are you talking about for services or for community organizing?
I assume services. We'll see if Bonnie responds.
Okay. So right now, Access Living will not get compensated for services that are for persons who are not citizens. But I would like to point out that community organizing is not providing independent living service. Meaning community organizing is supporting people to be empowered and to be engaged and advocate for themselves. The funding for Michelle's position, a good deal comes through private donations. And so forth. So it's not government funding. There are, however, funders that are very interested in funding social justice initiatives, and immigration is coming to the fore for a lot of those donors. So I can say that. I think that's what I would have to say about it. Mm-hmm.
I would like to point out that, like Amber just mentioned, there's a lot of private donors that care about the issue on immigration, and we've been lucky to be able to provide like medical equipment through funds that they've been very graciously able to donate to us, and we are able to help individuals that would not be able to access a wheelchair or a walker or a cane, etc. With these funds. And so anytime any donor wants to do that, you're welcome. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that's all I've checked the chat and the different chats and Q&A, and that's all the questions for this section. So I will turn to slide 16 and turn it back over to you, Amber.
Okay, sure. So the top of the next slide, this is Amber speaking. The top of the next slide says supporting individuals to stay involved and energized on systems advocacy. That's one of the objectives of this training. So we're going to just be upfront and tell you what we do. Okay, so the list that we have here is a list that I wrote down based on the input that Candace and Michelle gave me. So here's the compilation that they came up with. They said that different types of communities have different dynamics, very important to recognize. You need to understand what those dynamics are in order to be able to support people. Second, an important thing is food, to be honest. People want to be able to control food at their events or gatherings. They need choices. They need culturally appropriate food. They need food that works with their disabilities. So giving people food that works for them makes sure that they feel welcomed. Very important. Another thing that supports people, and that is a big problem, I think, nationwide, is just funding for transportation. Being able to help people like pay for a bus ride to Access Living or whatever transportation method they might need to use. You just have to basically build in transportation funding, or else you might not have people show up. A non-judgmental environment is very, very important. Michelle talked about trust. Building trust is one of the most important things in community organizing. When you are a community organizer and you're asking people to do systems advocacy, you're asking a lot. They need to know that they are welcome, that they will not be judged, so that you can bring the best out of them for systems advocacy. So non-judgmental, very important. Both Candace and Michelle also do a lot of one-on-ones and personal checkups. So I know they go to birthday parties, people gather for dinner. We also provide support to our groups in times of loss. Unfortunately, Campiano Vidas, for example, just lost a young person who was involved with our group named Freddie Lopez. And so actually 2 days ago, everybody went to, drew away. And I'm sorry to bring this up, but it's an example of how community organizing is personal. And also, just these are the things that happen in the disability community. We have to recognize and honor that. And people see that. So this is about the building of trust. Okay. The next item is also supporting members' involvement with other organizations and community meetings. So this is very interesting. A lot of people come to us and they say, you know what, I would like to be more involved with this other group in my community, but they're not accessible to me. I need some help. So, for example, Candace has joined a YLP members at community meetings and helped them get confidence and feel comfortable being in these settings. So helping to be a bridge helps them be more empowered. Michelle has done the same in religious settings. So maybe somebody comes in and says, I don't feel welcomed or my church is not accessible. So she goes with them to help make sure that access opens up. And then in general, people need meaningful participation. So developing roles in meetings and projects is very important. You need to look to someone's strengths. Obviously, if you keep harping on what a person cannot do, they're going to be very demoralized. They're going to be very disappointed, and they're not going to come back. So you do need to emphasize people's strengths, and members can help each other. So one of the strengths I hope everybody recognizes of Centers for Independent Living, that cross-disability setting builds an atmosphere of flexibility, helping each other be involved, supporting one another, etc. So those are some of the examples of ways that Michelle and Candace support people to stay involved. But is there anything you'd like to add to this list that we built?
In my tenure being a community organizer, one of the challenges has been working with young people is navigating how their parents view what they can or cannot do. And so we've done a lot of relationship navigating between supporting them with taking the skills that they've learned in our groups and actually transferring them home, and sometimes actually being a voice between the parent and the young adult, with encouraging the parent to support the young person in learning what their new leadership skill is.
Yeah, I just want to echo the fact that you have to talk to the family, and I said this before. It's really important to build that also trust with the family, so that they can like cut that umbilical cord, if you may. because they're so protective of their loved one.
Yeah. So in summary, this is Amber speaking. Again, I want to emphasize asking people to take on systems advocacy as part of a community organizing group is a big thing to do. And they have to trust you, and they have to feel welcome, and it needs to be something that, feels like you are asking them to take on the moral fight for the disability movement. They have to feel that. And so it takes a lot of work to get people to that position. Next slide.
Okay, so yes, I'm sorry.
So one of the ways that we gather a caucus in AYLP and in Cambiando Vidas is typically we meet to discuss what they've been hearing in the community, and then we develop campaigns over time. Another thing is that we begin to identify issues that is a common thread between the members and figure out and do research on how it impacts our community as a whole. Is it just an individual issue, or is it a community issue, or is it a systemic issue? Another way that we decide how to take on issues is that we look into what stakeholders that we have that has an interest in our issue. Also, who are the power players? What are some solutions and demands that we can come up with to change the system? And in a process of escalation towards achieving what's needed. And what's important for us is that we identify the systemic issue which is causing problems for individuals. So for example, when I first started this work, bullying was a hot topic. And what we found out is that within our group, a lot of members within our group were experiencing bullying in their school days. And then it started to become a local issue where different schools were trying to tackle the issue of bullying. But what they were missing were the disability lens of dealing with systemic issues as it pertained to bullying. And so AYLP was able to develop solutions and demands for what they wanted to see within the disability community as it addressed bullying. And this is a typical process for our Access Living community organizing groups across the board. Next slide.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our organizational buy-in. So the way we do things here at Access is that we as staff summarize our issues in a way that can be easily presented to our management. So like Candace just said, like we talk about bullying or immigration, and then we propose it to our manager, and then try to figure out how to proceed with our campaign. And then Access Living leadership needs to, so we try to come to make it easier for Access Living the leadership to understand and support us as a community organizing group, to know what we need to work on and how to work together to achieve what we need to achieve. We work with Amber as organizers to communicate the emerging topics to the executive leadership and the board, to see if there's any precedent for supporting these topics. And then Amber coordinates the use of the policy screening tool that she spoke about before a bit, and then the board approves if needed.
Next slide.
Yeah. This is Amber speaking. So cross-department updates are an important part of our process. So when we have new issue areas, they are included on the agenda of the weekly government affairs meetings. And what happens is that the organizers will provide an update on what the new issue areas are. And what will happen is that staff who work on other approaches in that general topic area, so for example, the policy staff, the legal staff, independent living staff, or executive leaders, will weigh in and collaborate on tweaks to the advocacy, because For example, let's say that an issue comes forward that people in the grassroots are experiencing, but it turns out to have to do with a problem at a city agency that Access Living staff have a funding relationship with. So how do we tweak the advocacy so we have a way forward for the grassroots work at the same time as managing all the other pieces of the relationship? So there's collaboration, and then what happens is then the organizers bring the new suggestions back to the grassroots group members for review and action where agreed upon. So there is an ability there's a channel for ideas to go from the grassroots to all these other kinds of support and then back. Mm-hmm. If we could have the next slide, that'd be great. Okay. The person who had the question about campaigns, your question is about to be answered. So the top of this slide says building out the campaign. So once we gain approval to work on a specific topic area, we develop the campaign with the community organizing groups and other affected stakeholders. And today we'd like to give 2 examples of campaigns. The first is the response on the Stephon Watts situation by AYLP. And the second example is going to be about the city ID or city key that Cambion Rivita's worked on. Next slide.
So this is Candace speaking. One of the issue areas that AYLP has been working on is actually the response to police interactions and people with disabilities. In 2012, there was a young man with autism. His name was Stephon Watts, and he was 15 years old, and he was a high school student. He was in his home, and his house was coded, and it was recommended to his family that when he has a crisis to call the police. His family had a record of calling the police maybe about 10 times, but unfortunately, the 10th time, he was actually killed by police in his home. The Stephon Watts family lives in Calumet City, which is a south suburb right outside of Chicago. And as his campaign emerged, his family actually reached out to Access Living because they were aware that we were the only disability rights group who was raising awareness around policing and disability. His parents then approached us to see if we could support keeping his name alive by creating a systems change campaign that would make sure that no other person with a disability would actually come out like Stephon Watts. Next slide, please. AYLP members felt that what happened to Stephon Watts could actually happen to them. And we worked together to find a possible systemic advocacy solution, but it has actually been a very tricky and not smooth process at all. One of the things that we've done a lot of in the beginning of this process is a lot of awareness and education. AYLP members worked to learn more about system solutions. So in the beginning, we were learning about what CIC training was. We were learning about statistically how people with disabilities come in contact with the police. We were talking to different stakeholders and different organizing groups, which were our community partners. And we raised awareness about the experiences of youth with disabilities of color who had police interactions in different situations. In light of that, there was a unfortunate another incident that happened in Chicago, which was called, his name was Laquan McDonald, and that was a young man who also had a disability, but the police shot him 16 times. And so that resulted in the U.S. Department of Justice wanting to investigate the Chicago Police Department on excessive force and their practices and patterns. AYLP realized that when they came to our city, they still was not highlighting the disability lens of police practices. And so AYLP organized action outside of the public hearings that the Department of Justice was holding, and they highlighted victims of police violence and disabilities. And then we went inside and actually organized people with disabilities to participate in the public comments and town halls. AYLP wanted to see if, after all of the awareness, we wanted to actually work on creating a policy change. And so we worked together to see if we could come up with a state level bill that could do something to stop more situations like Stephon Watts from happening. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges the AYLP has faced in developing what we call the Stephon Watts bill has been really implemented across disability lens. Our group is represented of people who have autism, of people who experience mental illness, of people who have physical disabilities, and so on and so forth. And we knew we did not want to tackle on an issue that we didn't have experience in. We also did not want to override other fights that were going on. So, for example, here in the mental health community, we're fighting for funding for mental health facilities. We didn't want to take away from that fight. We wanted to add to it. And so, in our initial discussions with external partners, there was facts and statistics more related to mental health, but not necessarily focusing on people with autism. And so a challenge that came up for us is that autistic advocates outside of AYLP challenged us to be more careful about including neurodivergent concerns as a part of this bill process. And so we drafted a bill. We had a series of information sessions over the last year and a half from advocates, from stakeholders, from medical professionals, and from different things. And then we drafted a bill in the process. And currently, AYLP is focusing on educating non-disability stakeholders in Chicago about the process that people with disabilities go through when they actually have to call 911 and get support.
This is Amber. I just want to also be super clear about when we say that a draft bill is in process, we had a draft bill, but on dialogue with community partners, we basically decided to put that particular bill on hold. And so we are doing research to see if we could develop something new that takes a very different tack and is more appropriate to addressing the concerns of everyone. So we definitely had a process for making sure that happened. So excuse the interruption.
No, thank you. Next slide. So working towards a systemic solution, AYLP's take is that if police presence will escalate someone's crisis or meltdown or put them at risk or harm, it would be better if a non-police emergency response person arrived on site if appropriate. Like I stated before, most of our group members are from different communities of color, and in those spaces, there's not a lot of support for people to get the proper care that they could possibly have. And so for us, this heavily influenced why we felt like police presence should not be in situations of a non-police response. If someone has so we found that in a model of our emergency system, we have the police, we have the firefighters, and we have EMTs. But what is happening is that if a person has a crisis and you dial 911, and what you request is a support for a person who is having a crisis, they will immediately send the police. And so we wanted to find a system that is equivalent to sending an EMT in. Okay. Yep. What we wanted to make sure that happened we wanted to make sure that happens in Illinois, or one of the issues, that comes up with this solution is that the bill's idea, the different communities, the autism and the mental health community had conflicting cultural beliefs. And so one of the things that came up was the fact that coercion might be a factor. So that's why we had to reevaluate how this bill would impact our community. Also, how can we make sure that law recognizes the difference between a crisis, a meltdown, and a panic attack? We found that people were using that language interchangeably. And so AYLP is going to spend this next summer educating different stakeholders on what the definition of that is, and also further get community members involved in developing our bill. So currently AYLP and Access Living is investigating current or developing models for mobile units that do not involve police and do not include staff trained to help with de-escalation. Next slide, please. Again, working towards a systemic solution can be complicated in this area because we want to make sure that all voices are heard. And we want to make sure that due to our political climate that we're able to pass a effective policy. And so options that are currently available in Illinois are limited, and it's complicated because the issues of self-determination and involuntary commitment in Illinois has a different set of laws that we don't necessarily, or members of the community don't necessarily believe are supportive. And Illinois has some existing laws about protections against involuntary confinement, and we don't want our bill to advocate or to influence that policy.
But this is Amber. I think some of the input that we got from advocates is that the language in Illinois law about involuntary commitment might not cover all the situations where people might be facing risks to their ability to self-determine. So this is a very complex thing and definitely needs a little more discussion. When the second bullet point, I just want to say that we probably need to edit that in the final version that you post online for going forward. Yes, the bill effort is definitely not about crisis intervention training, but the thing is that the final answer that we're hoping for, it may or may not involve 911. I feel like we're open to, like, 911 might not be the thing. But the thing is, like, people need a way to get contact in emergency. And so this is all very much in discussion at this point in time. I don't know if you, yeah.
Okay. We really wanted to show you how our systemic solutions can be a very complex process. But AYLP is dedicating to moving forward and really taking in what our different stakeholders and our group members have to say. Next slide. More about Stephon Weiss's bill is that we, over the summer, are going to be having more discussions with advocates from disability groups who could be affected to fine-tune what is needed in Illinois. We'll be having discussions with the 911 operators, the EMTs, the Fraternal Order of Police, and ASHME, which all represent, I guess, this community of this response. And then we're going to have planning series of about 5 community discussions on the bill this summer. And then the plan is to hopefully continue shaping the bill to something that's useful and agreed upon by stakeholders by spring of next year. We've already been working on this for 1.5 years now. To also take into consideration our political climate as well. When we first started this process, we actually didn't have a state budget. So
yeah, this is Amber. Illinois did not have a state budget, an on-time one, for 3 years running. This year is the first year that we've had a state budget that was actually on time. So certainly budget considerations have been making this very complicated. Okay.
Next slide.
Okay, that brings us back to our Q&A. So thanks. All right, great overview, Candace. Let's see if we have any questions. I know the first question we have came in early. This is really a carryover from the last section. Bonnie asks, this is a bit more detail from her previous question, I think. How does your center find funds for offering these services? Your center has a much larger staff than most centers. How do you find funding to pay for these consumers and support staff? Donations from private projects, that's not repeatable by others unless you can share where you're finding these resources. So how can smaller centers build programs like you all are describing here on a smaller scale and get it paid for?
Yeah, this is Amber. So Access Living, yes, does have 65 people. That is bigger than a lot of centers for independent living, although I will say some centers are bigger than us. But yes, for smaller centers for independent living, okay, Access Living's budget sources. We have some federal money, of course. We have some state money. We have foundations and grants grant money that we have. We have money from both major and small donors. So because Chicago is in an urban area, we also have more access to people that have some pretty deep pockets and who have built relationships with Access Living over a long period of time. And then the fifth source of funding is also from businesses. So we have 5 different streams. So I'll say those again. So we have federal money, we have state money, we have private donations, we have businesses. And wait a minute, I think I'm missing a thing. Did I say major and minor donors? Anyway, that's the general list. So a lot of the money that comes in from businesses and from private donors goes towards financing the advocacy department. And the reason why is because they don't have requirements about, lobbying or any of that sort of thing. So the way that I would suggest things work for a smaller center for independent living is to really take a look at what funding individual staff actually do get. This is important. Like, do you have all the staff fully funded through state or federal grants? That might make it complicated to do some systems advocacy. It doesn't prevent it entirely, but it makes it a little bit complicated. It would be advisable, I would think, if whoever on staff is designated to do advocacy has at least some portion of their salary funded through a grant or private donations or sponsorship that allows them the flexibility to do whatever the center wants. So that for Access Living has been an important approach, is like looking at the composition of staff salary and where the funding sources come from. Because the fewer requirements you have from the funding, the greater flexibility you will have to take on different topics. The other thing is that I do think that in the world of philanthropy, there are increasing discussions about where to fund social justice. And, I think a lot of people try to look for grants just by, running searches and looking for grants that are posted and everything. But you can also reach out to foundations themselves and say, you know what, I'd really like to have a talk with your staff about some stuff that we'd like to fund. And I'd like to teach you about what it is that we're funding. And I'd love if you could come visit us. And let's talk about like whether that kind of work could be funded for you in the future. So building relationships with philanthropy groups also opens the doors for funding advocacy opportunities. So that's important. If you are very small, and let's say you are in a rural area, and you have a staff of maybe 3 to 5 people, right? There is a question about whether, some funding could come from local businesses. That's always an option. But I also sort of wonder about whether centers for independent living can partner with each other, whether or not there can be joint grants that are done sort of like a consortium setup. So that's another idea. But I think the biggest thing is just really taking a look at, like what's actually happening, who is interested in funding that, and being proactive about seeking out funds. Tell people this is what we want to do. Make sure they know what you want to do. So that would be the advice that I have for the moment.
Okay, great. Great examples and guidance, Amber. All right, let me give just 10 more seconds to see if any other questions come through. You can use the Q&A feature there in Zoom, or you can type your question in the cart chat or send me an email. Okay, next question comes from Brad. Brad asks, have you met resistance from lawmakers while trying to pursue new legislation for protecting people with disabilities? If so, how do you get them on your team? Do you find that diplomatic or friendly approaches are usually effective?
I think that's any of us.
I feel like I am missing the gist of the question.
The question is, do we find any difficulty, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, do we find any difficulty in getting legislators to
Be on our team.
To support us?
yeah.
Oh, yeah, so this is Amber speaking. It depends on what topic you're talking about. You know, I think all legislators can be talked to about disability issues. They will all have uniquely individual approaches to looking at disability. Some of them don't know anything about it, you know. Some of them know quite a bit, actually, because of long experience with programs that we have to use, or they might have family members and friends with disabilities, or they might be a person with a disability themselves. I think for at least the work that Candace was trying to do, there has been a pretty good amount of support from Chicago area legislators, but the opposition tended to be, at least on the first version of the bill, just some pushback from legislators who have closer ties to the police, who felt like what Candace and AYLP was working on was anti-police. It's not anti-police, it's just looking for an appropriate solution. So trying to navigate those discussions was a lot more complicated than, say, somebody who was a little less tied to that perspective. So trying to navigate the political relationships is important, yes, but I think we've seen a number of legislators at this point support different things that Access Living does. I don't know how you felt that legislators did. I mean, it seemed like what the initial idea of just some kind of response bill, when there was initial reach out to legislators who might be sponsors, they were enthusiastic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. I don't see any more questions. We will have another Q&A break at the end of the presentation. So I will go ahead to slide 28 and turn it over to Michelle.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the campaign of the City Key with that Cambiando Vidas got involved with. So the City Key was a joint effort or collaborative effort with many immigrants' rights organizations here in Chicago, or in Illinois, I should say. So the idea was to provide an ID for immigrants who do not have an ID, so that if they go to the doctor or they are trying to get into an event or a building within the city, that they would be able to present this ID to them, to the place where they're going. The city clerk, on your slide it says the city treasurer, but it's actually the city clerk, so apologies. The city clerk approached a group of us and asked us to work with them in developing the City Key. So when Cambiando Vidas went into discussions with this group, we talked about the needs of people with disabilities who are immigrants and how having this ID would impact our community, and that it would not only impact immigrants with disabilities, but it would impact a larger, a broader community, right? So we had community discussions within Chicago with homeless groups. We had discussions with groups who were LGBTQ. We had discussions with other the domestic violence groups, whom are also another group that are impacted of not having an ID. So then we walked or talked to the city treasurer. I mean, I keep reading the slide. The city clerk, I apologize. The city clerk. And we wanted to kind of mimic, in a sense, the fact that in San Francisco, New York, these two cities come to mind right now, but they have a similar city ID that has been working really well for the past 5 years. So we wanted to work with them on doing one for us here. So we did a lot of community awareness and work with these partners with the city to educate the community on what. Oh, sorry, can you check the slide?
Tim. Yeah.
Sorry, I keep talking and I forget about the slides.
No problem. There you go.
Okay.
So yes, so around building the disability activism around the city ID, we needed to create awareness and education. So we worked very closely again with the city clerk to do educational workshops, speaking more about workshops, on what City Key would do for our community. So we planned different workshops in different parts of the city where the clerk would come in and explain how we would benefit. Or how and who would benefit from the City Key. And then, so she was very, and I said she was, so she was very, she listened to what the community had to say. She was very, how do you say it, like, very careful about making sure that what we had to say or what the community had to say that needed to be on the card was on the card, or what didn't was not there, for the protection of the individuals that were going to be using the card. I just want to do a quick example of it. For example, the address. Many individuals felt that having an address on their ID would jeopardize in case of ICE stopping them or asking them. They did not, you don't have to put your address if you do not want to. So in coalition, again, with the group that we worked with and these public events that we had, so we had to do, we passed an ordinance 2 years ago now, almost 3, in where the city program was called the City Key. And as of last April, it became official. So now we're able to get in, like, well, oh, sorry, next slide. I keep forgetting. My goodness. Oh.
Just backing you up.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So the City Key. So what it does, the City Key is an optional ID. It's a valid government issued ID. But it has your photo identification card. It's for Chicago residents, and you can use it regardless of your housing status, criminal background, immigration status, or gender identity. The City Key will serve you as a 3-in-1 or an all-in-one card, 3-in-1 card. It will not be only valid as a government-issued ID card. It also serves as a library card, which is really cool. Transit card, which is also awesome. And additionally, the benefits with partnering with cultural institutions, local businesses, and sports teams that have been announced over the next, have already been announced over the next month. Then next slide. Yes. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. I forget. I don't know why. I get too excited about talking. Or nervous. So the intersectionality within the City Key. So obviously, it's across the board. The idea is for everybody. We have many different communities: the homeless community, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, victims of domestic violence, undocumented individuals. So this ID was made for everybody, and that was the main point that we wanted to carry across. So then I wanted just to point out that for the city key, for example, for the LGBTQ community, they have the non-binary option if you choose as your name. For many people who are very poor or low income, they might not have an ID, so then they can get an ID free of charge if they need one, if they don't have an ID. And also, if you're, like I said before, if you're an undocumented individual, you can have access to supports and services from the city with this ID, like we just mentioned before, transit, library, etc. And then, of course, like in every campaign, oh, next slide. I look at Amber and I'm like, what? Next slide, thank you. There's some challenges within every campaign. So there was, I think somebody mentioned this before, with the politicians or the people that we want to work with. So there was some pushback from different groups when this ID was coming out, from different communities of color. They're still trying to make amends with this. So that is still in that process. Hopefully they get over it soon. Then since then, the city key has, so it's been through a process. Right now, it's still fairly new. Like I said, it just came out officially in April. So it's in a fairly new, it's a trial period, I guess. They're giving it, as of now, you can get your ID for free. And then thereafter, they're gonna charge. But the city clerk is working with the county to see if that could also work into having the ID be valid for county buildings, so that you can use your ID when you enter a county building, and be effective there. And also, to the last point, that you have to, we talked about the distrust or trust that you have to build. The immigrant community was also very distrustful regarding the ID at first, because they were thinking that the documents or the information that was going to be asked of them could be kept in, a database or whatnot, and then obviously it would be revealed to ICE or whatever. They were very assured that this would not happen, and it hasn't up until now. We hope not ever. So next slide.
This is good. It's all good. Can you change to the next slide? This is Amber speaking. We have just one more quick section to get through before the final Q&A discussion period, at which time I'm sure people might have questions for Michelle. But just to get through this one last section to open it up for Q&A, I want to talk about how these issues, these emerging issues, how this works with the organization. So the title of the slide says Emerging Issues and Organizational Impact. And so let's look at how the systems advocacy work on emerging issues has a ripple effect on the organization. And what have we learned? Next slide. So from a 360-degree view, taking a look at the parallel internal work at Access Living. As AYRP and Cambiado Vidas have worked on their campaign, there's been a parallel process of support among staff at Access Living. So, for example, as we heard, updating colleagues on the status of campaigns and whether approaches need to be shifted. There's also quite a bit of problem-solving issues of communications with community partners. We have to look at ensuring internal accountability, such as reporting and mission alignment. And then, of course, we also need to be engaging partners and donors to keep funding this work. Next slide. So the top of this slide says encouraging investment in emerging issues. So just to elaborate a little bit on something I said earlier, when an organization commits to addressing an emerging issue area, it can attract new donors. Donors like to see that an organization is doing new things that meet a community's needs. And some donors are particularly interested in serving specific types of communities. Some donors are developing emerging areas of philanthropy themselves. So we do get quite a lot of donors or funders that said, you know, we've decided to fund things this way for the last 10 years, but this year is the year we're changing everything up. So that happens sometimes. Donors that have invested in racial or immigration justice are just learning about investing in those areas as they overlap with disability. So right now, there's quite a bit of racial justice funding work going on, but it's not necessarily always going to an overlap between disability and racial justice. Immigration, brand new for immigration funders to be thinking about disability. So this is very interesting and an opportunity. So communication with donors is key. Next slide, please. It is very important to get the right staff on board. Diversity in the Center for Independent Living staff is really important. It will attract diverse people to get involved in different ways with your center. So I myself am a white person. If it was just me, I mean, I really don't think we'd be attracting all the folks that Candace and Michelle are able to attract, you know. So it is very important to have white people, Black people, Latino people, Asian people, you know, like people will come when they see folks that look like them. If we have a diverse team, at least one of us is going to be a peer to the consumers and the community and to donors. And there's another aspect here where we also need to feel that our colleagues are going to back us up or keep us as safe as possible. So when we have a diverse team, as we go into different communities, we can work together to make sure that we feel safe and that we provide a safe environment to others. And finally, when staff have diverse viewpoints, we have richer expertise from which to shape the work. So you have to be brave about doing this. And I'm just going to say one thing, for those of you who are listening to this webinar who are white people, I cannot emphasize this enough as a white person. We have got to learn from different points of view, different types of expertise from different communities and really help boost that work. Otherwise, we're just going to be doing the same old thing. We have got to get that richness of experience and help support it and move it forward. So that's my challenge to all you folks out there who's the white folks. So the next slide, please. For those of you who are concerned about things like organizational planning, it is a year-round effort, of course, to secure grants and donations. I mean, you really have to have like a year-round kind of thing. If you are somebody who is a manager, think about the fact that you need to create staff benchmarks that are clear and reasonable. In systems advocacy, you know, it's not going to be the same thing as I provided a service to one person. You know, it's going to be much more about the community, had an event, we built relationships, you know, people gain knowledge, that sort of thing. So it's really important to measure activities such as meetings, trainings, actions, and recruiting, and also outcomes such as progress on issues, indications of strength in community, individual leader growth. As a supervisor, I know it's super important to support staff in use of vacation time and sick time. When I look at the people that are sitting with me here at the table, they work their buns off all the time. I mean, trying to ask you guys to like take time off is like pulling teeth, okay? So sick time, vacation time, they're there for a reason. If we don't take care of staff, like the staff can't help other people. It's very important. Always have a backup plan. Right? So let's say your campaign isn't going well, you got to have a backup plan for that. Let's say a staffer has a health issue and they have to be out for a while. Who's going to handle things? You need to have a backup plan. It is important to empower staff in professional and leadership development. We need to strive for creating inclusive and welcoming space. And I would say that that's just as important for the communities we face today as it was for the very first Centers for Independent Living that started. You know, so back in the 70s, you know, you're talking about creating these welcoming spaces that were run by people or people with disabilities. I think that, you know, society has changed a lot about what they think a welcoming space is supposed to be about, and you do have to think about what you're doing there. It is critical to show appreciation and celebrate all the victories, publicize your successes, engage the public, make sure people know what you're doing. And I'm going to hand it over to Candace for the very last item.
advocacy is a core service and is not extra. In Access Living's view, we as a still are supposed to be welcoming, developing a sense of belonging, and developing safe feelings. This is an ongoing learning process, and sometimes we don't do it well. Well, sometimes we do it well, and other times we don't. We think our process of engaging people with systems advocacy pays off. Skills can help systems advocacy be authentic and support people to be ready to work with us over the long term. Next slide.
All right.
Ta-da!
Great. All right. Perfect. We've got 10 minutes left for our final Q&A. So I'll start with the one that's come in, but please, we've got plenty of time. So I hope to see some more questions roll in over the next few minutes. So first question comes from Bonnie, and Amber, you touched on this a moment ago on the getting it right slide 36, but Bonnie asks, do staff need to be part of a minority group or protected class in order to develop programs like the ones you've discussed? If we have not had personal experience with these four, can we be the ones to develop trust and guidance needed between policymakers and affected consumers? And Bonnie submitted that before your slide, but I thought I'd give you all the opportunity to expand on that if you'd like to.
I have a couple of
Sure.
and I think my coworkers also have opinions about this. I'm just going to say two thoughts, and then you guys back me up or follow up or whatever. The first item is that the issues that Michelle and Candace work on are very sensitive issues. And I do believe that when you have somebody who belongs to the group that is affected, it's going to be more authentic and you can build more trust with the people that you need to attract. So those issues are very, very sensitive. So that is something to consider. The other thing is that we have a different program here at Access Living, and it's our youth mentoring program. And our youth mentoring program works to pair young people with disabilities with older adults with disabilities who have disability mentoring. The focus of that group is really especially focusing on like recruiting young people of color and connecting them with adults of color who are their mentors. And as it happens, the staffer who coordinates the mentoring program is white. So for her, it's been very important to figure out how to leverage relationships and work with other people to say, hey, I'm a resource, I'm here to support what's going on, but you know, you guys are in the front. So it is possible for certain kinds of programs, but again, like it's not like a white person in that program is like necessarily speaking for people of color in the program. She's just like creating the opportunity for people to come forward, which is kind of more like back support. But if you're talking about something like what Candace and Michelle do, it does help to have that representation front and center. What do you guys think?
So for us, I mean, it's very important. We want allies. You know, we work with allies that are not from the Latinx community. We welcome allies. However, I think as Amber mentioned, it's very important for us. And again, I keep going back to that trust. For me as a Latina woman with a disability, it's going to be easier and better to come into the community and build that trust with my members because they know where I'm coming from. You know, I'm a Latina woman with a disability who also has lived experiences with immigrants. So I can relate. So you need to have relatable stories so that they can feel understood. So I think that is very important when you're working with your members and trying to recruit them, and trying not just to recruit them, but to try to get them involved in the issues is key.
I was just going to say that I think it's important because of the cultural awareness and the experience that you face. I think we all come from different walks of the city. Well, not think, I know.
For real.
For real. I know that we all come from different walks of the city, and I know due to our, I guess, racial identity, we experience and navigate the world differently. And so I think it's important to have people who represent that to help. If it's an issue that you're going to organize around, it helps to know all parts of the story. It also helps to investigate or navigate like how key players play a role in it. Because if we don't have that background story, we may not even be able to win. But also, it's important for us to do this work and be person-centered. And so Michelle talked a lot about trust, and I think if you don't have a person who represents what you're fighting for, it doesn't go in the right direction, or the intent isn't right, or you just won't get that authentic experience or systemic change.
Yep. This is Amber. I would just also like to reemphasize that, I mean, Michelle's work, especially on immigration, you're talking about something that's kind of life and death, really. You know, like you're asking people to trust that they will work with you and not be deported. You know, and Candace is asking the community to talk about something that's really, really scary. The possibility that if you have an interaction with a police officer or other emergency response personnel, that it could go south and maybe cost you your life. So the sensitivity of both of those topics is important to consider as well. But I think the point about allies, though, yes, allies are super important. But there is this thing about the peer effort that's important for the organizing.
Good. All right, great guidance, thanks. Okay, I'm gonna try to sneak in 2 more questions that have come in. So Betta asks if you can share the policy evaluation tool. And I know for the folks at Access Living, they've already said that's okay. So if you all can get it to us, we'll be happy to get it out to the audience and post it on the website as well.
Yeah, that's Amber. Yes, that's okay. If people have questions, please email me about it.
Okay. All right, perfect. And last question for now anyway, Paula asks, to what extent does Access Living get involved in legal disputes, if at all? And I think, Paula, how much time do you have? But do you guys have a short answer or a summary that you can give for that?
I will try to be as quick as possible. Access Living engages in both class action and individual cases. We focus on fair housing cases and on ADA Title III cases, which are about access to places of public business. In the past, we've had attorneys that have also looked at, that have worked on Olmstead litigation. Access Living is an original co-counsel in 3 Olmstead class action lawsuits in the state. So in the past, we've had Olmstead attorneys, but right now we focus on fair housing and we focus on ADA Title III. An example of the major litigation that we have going on right now, we just filed a class action lawsuit against a program at the city of Chicago, the Affordable Rental Housing Program, for failing to be accessible for people with disabilities and make sure that housing available is accessible. So that is a major citywide lawsuit. The other really big lawsuit is actually in the area of transportation. Access Living is working with a private attorney, and we filed a lawsuit against Uber for not having accessible Uber service for people with physical disabilities in the city of Chicago. So that was the first Uber lawsuit that was based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Prior lawsuits were based on other pieces of the law. So those are some examples, but an example of an individual piece of that litigation is a lawsuit that we filed on behalf of a little girl with a physical disability who is, I think, about 8 right now. And she was going to a school that had a classroom on the 2nd floor, and they refused to move the classroom down to the 1st floor. The girl has a degenerative muscular disability, and so the school was basically forcing her to push herself up on her butt up and down the stairs and being totally inaccessible about the whole thing. So that's an example of the individual litigation that Access Living has taken up.
Nice job. That's a lot to cover in a minute and a half. So, okay, thanks. Good summaries. Well, it's 4:30 here on the East Coast, but I really want to thank you all sincerely, Candace, Michelle, and Amber. This was such a great summary of the work that you do. And I really applaud you all for the really intersectional approach that you've taken to some of your advocacy strategies there at Access Living. I think it's really interesting to see in some ways how unique and complex it can be, and in some ways how similar and how natural it is for Centers for Independent Living to be doing this work. So because we're out of time, I just encourage all of you to send us your questions. If any of you have questions as you mull this over or discuss it with others, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know Candace, Michelle, and Amber were nice enough to share their contact information, and you're always welcome to reach out to me as well. Again, my email is just tim@ncil.org. And thanks to all of you. We had a great audience today, and I really appreciate that all of you took the time to sign up and take an afternoon to spend with us and learn about this. This will be archived on ILRU's website, so you can revisit it and share it with others. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.